Let's work on various ways of selecting objects in our artwork. We select objects primarily by using the Selection tool and the Direct Selection tool, and they have very different functions which we'll learn about. I'm going to select the Selection tool, which is the black arrow. And I'll move the Selection tool over various objects. And notice what happens when I hover over an object. There's a little box below the cursor that appears, and that means that an object is available to be selected. So I will select one of those circles. Maybe I'll zoom in a bit first. Go back to the Selection tool, and I'll select that circle. And notice that there's a little box around it now. It's called a bounding box. That means the object is selected and can be moved or manipulated in some way. We can do that by using the control handles. We'll learn about that shortly. Now I'll select the other circle, and we see a bounding box around that circle, but the bounding box disappeared from the other box. And that's what happens when we select individual objects like this. It selects the current object and deselects the other. If I want to select both of them at the same time, I can select one of the circles, hold down my Shift key, and select the other one. And we can see now that both objects are selected. And if I click on one of those objects, both of them will move at the same time. I'm going to fit that artboard in the window again. So that's how the Selection tool works. And next we'll work with the Direct Selection tool. And the Direct Selection tool selects anchor points. Objects in Illustrator are made up of anchor points and paths. I'll select one of those green bamboo shapes, and we can see that there are 6 anchor points with a path connecting those anchor points. I'll zoom in a little bit so we can see a little bit better. So the Direct Selection tool is used to select anchor points. And by moving and manipulating the anchor points, we can change the shape of our object. And we can only do that with the Direct Selection tool. Notice that those anchor points are filled with blue, meaning that they are all selected. I'm going to click on one of those anchor points. And notice how when I hover over the anchor point, there's a little circle indicating that there is an anchor point available to be selected. So when I click on that anchor point stays blue, meaning it's selected. But notice how all the other anchor points are now white. That means they are not selected. So I can click on that anchor point that I just selected and move it to change the shape of the object. So I'm going to click, hold, and drag, and that changed the shape of that object. And I can do that with all of the anchor points now. I'll just click on this one, click, hold to select it, and drag. So that's one way of selecting anchor points and manipulating our artwork, is by using the direct selection tool. I actually don't want that object to look like that, so I'm going to go up to File and down to Revert, and this goes back to the last saved version of the document. And this is a handy little thing to know if you're working on a document and you make some changes you didn't really want to. If you haven't saved the document, you can revert it to the last saved state. I'm going to zoom in here on those circles. I'm going to get my selection tool. And another way of selecting objects is to create a marquee. I'm just going to click, hold, and drag around those two circles. I'm not going to click on them. I'm just going to click, hold, and drag a marquee around them. And now that's selected both circles. So that's another method of selecting more than one object. I'll click away from those objects to deselect it. And now I'll get the direct selection tool. And again, I'll draw a marquee, but I only want to select just the tops of those circles. And notice again what's happened. The top anchor point of each circle is a solid blue, meaning it's selected, while the other anchor points are white, meaning they're not selected. But both anchor points of those circles are selected. The top anchor point of each of those circles is selected. So if I grab a hold of an anchor point of one of those objects and drag up, notice that both objects move at the same time because both of the top anchor points of those circles are selected. I'll go back to File and Revert because I don't want those circles to look like that. Sometimes we may need to hide or lock objects in order to select other objects. I'm going to make sure, I'm going to zoom in on this first artboard. I'll select it in the status panel, and then I'll fit the artboard in the window. So I want to select, I'm going to get my selection tool, and I want to select the head of that animal. Kind of do it like a marquee selection because there are various parts of that illustration that make up that head. So I'm going to try doing a marquee selection. I'm just going to start somewhere off the head and try to drag a marquee. Well, that didn't work because I'm selecting the background rectangle. So that's not going to let me select anything else if I start my marquee there. I can do Control Z or go to Edit and Undo Move. So the rectangle is still selected. And what I'm going to do is lock that selection so that I can more easily select the head of that animal. So I'll go up to Object and down to Lock and over to Selection. And you can see the bounding box has disappeared. And if I try to click on it to select it, it doesn't select. So now I can use my selection tool to create a marquee around the head of that animal without worrying about moving the background rectangle. So now I've selected all of the objects that make up the head of this animal. But I actually want to remove the two eyes from the selection. So I'm going to hold down my Shift key. While everything is selected, I'm going to hold down the Shift key and click on the two eyes. So I'll click one eye and the other eye, and you can see those eyes have been removed from the selection. And now I want to hide the head of the animal but just leave the eyes, so I'll go up to Object, down to Hide, and over to Selection. So that hides everything except those two eyes which we removed from the selection. We have other methods for selecting objects, and one of those is by selecting similar objects. There are various commands that allow us to select specific attributes of an object and select other objects with similar attributes. So with my selection tool, I'm going to select one of those green bamboo shapes in the second artboard. And now I'll go up to Select, and then down to Same, and over to Stroke Color. The stroke is like the outline on an object. And notice how it selected all of those bamboo shapes because they all have the same stroke color. Now if I think I'm going to be selecting all of these shapes again, I can save this selection to make my workflow a little bit easier. So with all of those shapes selected, I'm going to go up to Select and down to Save Selection. And in the dialog box, I'll name it Bamboo and click OK. I'll deselect that group by clicking away from the art. And now if I want to select it again, I go up to Select and down to Bamboo, where I've saved that selection, and now it selects all of those objects. We can also select in outline mode. We've looked at outline mode before, which shows us the paths of the artwork. First, I'm going to go up to Object and Show All, so that we see the entire head of that animal again. And I'm going to go up to View and down to Outline. And selecting in outline mode is a little bit different than selecting in preview mode. You may want to click on the object like you normally do in preview mode, but it won't let you do that. You need to click on the path. So you can see if I click inside the eye of that animal, it doesn't let me select it. I need to click on the outline to select the eye. So I'll click on that, I'll hold down my Shift key and select the other eye. And now I'll just use my up arrow key to move those eyes up a little bit. So there are some various ways of selecting objects.